The diaphragm blades. The diaphragm blades are reasonably delicate. They're easily damaged. It's because they're long and fairly thin, it's easy to catch the cotton bud on them while you're cleaning them and bending them up on the return stroke. So there are 10 diaphragm blades in this case. Take care as you manipulate them. I'm manipulating these with tweezers, but I'm being very careful about how much pressure I apply as I hold them down with those tweezers. I don't want to mark the blades and I don't want to bend them. Okay, well that blade's nice and clean now. It's got quite a dull finish to it. They're more a dull charcoal grey. They're a bit shinier when they're covered in oil still. So those 10 blades, I'll just lay them out in order. They're all identical. There's nothing to concern yourself about there. And I'll have to clean all of these in turn, and you can see possibly just how much dirt and rubbish came off that blade. And there'll be oils here too which don't show in that cotton bud. I've got to work my way through those 10 blades before I can reassemble the shutter. Well, as you can see, I've been busy and I have my 10 diaphragm blades all clean and ready for reassembly. So I need to get my reassembly jig in place. Here's my reassembly jig for putting the diaphragms back together, and as you can see it is a 27mm and a 10mm half-inch drive sockets with a wooden peg to keep the two components aligned. And if that seems a bit Mickey Mouse to you, well, perhaps it is, but it works fine. And every time I've looked at it and thought I should have something flasher, it occurs to me that I can't think of anything that'll work better, so why bother making it? Now here's our retainer plate. This is what everything gets built on, and this goes on the jig flat face up. The rivet is facing up. The side with the 5 small divots in it goes down, and I can start putting the diaphragm blades in position. And they're just put on one on top of the other, until you get to the last few blades when things get complicated. That blade in particular, I noticed, doesn't really lie very flat. Now diaphragm blades, if they have spent any significant time well oiled up, they can get distorted when people attempt to change the aperture and the blades don't want to move. They can also get distorted if someone's rough when they're cleaning them. Of course I wouldn't be rough. It wasn't me. So now we've got to pull back the first blades that I put in place to allow me access to get the last few blades in place. And of course that has to be done without lifting the blades out of their pivots. One more to go. Okay, so I've got to get these blades over the top, and they don't want to go. And how do I get that back? See if I can slide that one underneath. That blade doesn't want to lift back far enough to allow me to slide that underneath. Let's see if I can do it this way. Try that. That'll do. I'll take that. And we just lift these back over the top. Without lifting anything off its pivots, and we should be in business. Now, the moving plate only goes on in one position. Some of those pins aren't dropping in. We just nudge that blade. It's better, and you can see the position there. Here's the rivet on that retaining plate, and I should be 2 positions round from there. I'm only 1, so I've done that wrong. Hang on. There we go. So here's the rivet on that plate, and here's our threaded section coming up which connects to the lever, and that should be 2 positions around from that rivet right there, and that's ready at the moment to have the case put on top. And the case only goes on one way. There's an alignment hole in the case there which goes over that little rivet, and if I can find it I can drop that in place. It's not wanting to, I'm not centered up properly here, I can see. That looks like it. So that's in, the rivets in place. Everything else looks like it's good. I'm going to flip this over, remove the outside part of my jig and put that underneath. The inside part I'm left sitting in there, so it holds that plate down while I put the screws in position. Of course there are 3 screws, and I'll get them run in. Do those up very lightly indeed. You don't want to damage a blade by getting it caught. If it's not seated correctly, its its pivot could be not sitting in the correctly in the hole, and the blade could get damaged if you just do the screws up tight. So always do them up very lightly until you've tested the diaphragm to make sure it functions. This last screw has just given me a bit of grief. That's better. Alright, I can take that off. Let's see what we've got. And what I'm looking for here is to make sure that all the blades move, none of them are left behind, and that they move smoothly. That appears to be fine. So I can go back and nip those 3 screws up. Don't over tighten those screws, they're only going into aluminium. The section is very thin and you'll strip those threads out if you overdo it. That action's okay, it's not as possibly as smooth as I would prefer. I know the blades are good because we've had them out and I've cleaned them all, so I know that it's not a problem with the surface of the blades. And I know the blades lie pretty flat. One of the blades had a bit of curve to it, but only very slight. So there's friction in here, it's elsewhere. Possibly the moving plate, there's a bit of friction between that and the case. Well, there is a solution to that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use some graphite powder to lubricate the mechanism. It's okay, you've just got to be careful to make sure you get rid of all graphite powder after the event. Blow away all the loose powder. So I've got the diaphragm in the closed position there, and normally what I do is just puff a bit into the centre, rotate the shutter housing so that that settles all the way around the edges, and then work the mechanism. And what that does, of course, is it means that the powder is working between mating surfaces and lubricating them. Now I've got to blow that out, and this is what you want. If you haven't got one already, get yourself a blower, something like this one. This one works fine. It wasn't expensive, probably came from China. It works a treat. I've got to go and blow all this out, make sure I get rid of all the loose powder. Well, that's it. That's our diaphragm, all working lovely and smoothly. No resistance there to speak of. And that means that the shutter case is ready at this stage for me to move on to the next part of the job, which is dealing with the mechanism plate. Okay, so the mechanism plate, well, we can tip the blades off. These are all very dirty. You can probably see that through the camera. They're all going to have to be cleaned carefully. Same mechanism there, I'll clean those with naphtha and a cotton bud. And the mechanism plate itself, it's got an odd look to it. It's a bit grey looking. I suspect that was graphite, probably graphite powder, possibly not, possibly it's just oil that's deposited on those surfaces. This piece is called the lens tube. It's quite dull, and that's surface corrosion, oxidation. Nothing particularly awful, won't cause a problem. This is the blade actuating ring. This is the piece that moves back, opens and closes the shutter blades. It's just quite dirty. Probably whatever was lubricating in there ceased to do a particularly good job. Graphite grease perhaps. I think it's moved around a lot. Okay, so all of this needs to be cleaned, and I'll clean that with naphtha and a cotton bud as before. Interesting patterns here on the machined surfaces. We'll blame that on the manufacturer. Right, cleaning. This is the face that runs against the shutter blades, so it's the one that it's most critical to have clean. You can probably see there's a bit of dirt coming off there. That'll be oil, a bit of dust. And this surface should be a lot cleaner than it is. I'm cleaning this internal piece here, this little recess, that's where the blade actuating ring will run. But all these other surfaces should be quite clean. That they're not just means that whatever was put in there in the way of lubricant had moved around. It wasn't concentrated in the area it would have done the most good, it was just spread. I can tell now by the silvery colour of this as I clean it that that's graphite that I'm seeing there, and that's graphite that's pretty much impregnated into the surfaces. And that as such won't do any harm. It's the oils that do it that have caused the problem, because they tend to not stay where they're put and end up sticking shutter blades and the like together. It's making sure these levers are clean and that they move freely. This detent spring here, which usually stays on the mechanism plate, is it's nice and clean. Okay, so that's looking quite good. Happy with the state of that. Let's deal with this blade actuating ring next. This is always the dirtiest component, just because it's usually been well lubricated with graphite grease. And it's not sitting particularly well there. This is spring steel, and it's made to separate at this point. That pin here is sprung loaded. That one was sticking down for some reason. It's something it may not be able to do once it's fully assembled. There may not be clearance enough there for it to push down that far. So that may cause no problem, but I'll certainly be aware of that. So here I'm mostly making sure I've got this very clean, because any old grease that's on there is probably captured dust and grit, which will act as a grinding paste if it's left in place. And the lens tube, we'll do this inside and out. It's the grey I'm seeing coming off here again will be lubricant. It's quite yellowish, that tells me that's the oil content I'm seeing there. The grey is probably the graphite compound, the component. It could easily be just dust too. And around this ring here, this recess, that's where the blade actuating ring runs. So that just needs to be cleaned and free from any grit and dust. Or sticky lubricants. Some old grease will go quite hard and sticky over time. The marks on this are almost certainly just mild surface corrosion. Not even significant enough to be to provide any roughness on those surfaces. It's just discoloration really. Yeah, you can see a bit of gleam to the brass there, that's certainly cleaned. Now there'd be no significant value in having a go at this with Brasso to make the stuff shine. You don't, there's no advantage of having shiny things inside a shutter, it can only bring you grief. Right, so to assemble these, I'm going to lubricate this lot with graphite powder. So I'm going to put nothing on here. You could lubricate this with graphite grease or similar, sparingly. Now I've got to get this detent spring hooked into place behind that post. That's it. My tweezers are not particularly good. They're worn out is the long and the short of it. And I thought I was being clever and I bought another set from the People's Republic of China, as we all do. And they weren't what I thought I was buying. They were something that looked like what I thought I was buying, but they were just pressed out of rubbish. So I've had to go and order the correct thing. Now one of these 3 screws is longer than the other because that goes through the bracket. So I've got to make sure I get the right screw in the right position. The 2 shorter screws don't go through the bracket. And the bracket is the bracket that holds our main drive spring in position, keeps it under tension. And the reason the screw is slightly longer, of course, is to make up the extra thickness of that bracket, and we're probably talking about 1/4 of a millimetre. And if you get the wrong one in the wrong place, you'll end up with the screw sticking out through the mechanism plate somewhere, which would catch a shutter blade. And the alternative is, if you had the short screw where the longer screw should be, you would end up with 1/4 of a millimetre less engagement. And the thickness of this plate that it's screwing into is very small, somewhere between 1/2 and 1 millimetre. Well, it's exceptionally easy to strip that screw out if you've got a short screw in there, and then you do it up as snug as you would normally do things up. Okay, so there's our mechanism plate assembled. That certainly moves nice and smoothly, and I'll lubricate that with graphite powder before I put the shutter blades in place. But first I've got to deal with these shutter blades because they are grimy. Alright, well I'll start swabbing this with some Naphtha. And see what sort of condition it's in. The marks may just be oily rubbish, or there may be corrosion marks on there. There's certainly some sort of physical mark on there, which I'll have to look at, I think. Just flip this over and do the other side. Typically it's the front surface is the most marked, and that's because people have had the lens off and they've sometimes poked their dirty finger at the shutter blades for good measure. Well, that surface looks quite good, but that surface there's certainly got some marking on it. You can just about, yeah, you can just see it there. So I'm going to polish those blades with some Brasso and then come back and clean them. Well, I have some Brasso here, metal polish, and I've got a block of hard foam plastic that I typically do this job on. And I'm holding the blade down very gently with the tip of a toothpick there to stop it running away. But you want a nice flat surface to do this on. And basically I'll just polish one surface and then the other. And then these have to be cleaned off carefully with naphtha afterwards to remove all traces of the metal polish. Otherwise you'd be leaving abrasive in the shutter. Well, that should be fine. And now I'll clean that off with a bit of naphtha and we'll see what sort of result we get. So, start here. The metal polish probably has some component in it, like a wax that is intended to protect surfaces from tarnish quickly. And so you want that all off. You don't want anything left as a deposit on your shutter blades. That's why it's important to do this. But the shutter blade there now is nice and clean and free from any marks. That looks just like a new shutter blade. And those marks were only slight, but they're always worth getting rid of. Those blades should be nice and clean. So I'll just do its formates and then we can start reassembling things. I've got those shutter blades all clean to my satisfaction now. They're looking very good indeed. Nice and clean. No sign of any of those marks that were on the surfaces previously. And I can go back to the mechanism plate and lubricate that with some graphite powder. Right, so I'm just going to drop a bit of graphite powder in there on that blade actuating ring. And then work the mechanism repeatedly to work that into the mating surfaces. That's sufficient, and I'll go and blow all that graphite powder away. Okay, I'll just move the blade actuating ring into the blade's open position. I can start putting the shutter blades back into position. And the first shutter blade goes here. Now, unlike the retina earlier shutters, there's no special first blade marked here. I'm just going to have to deal with this shutter blade while I speak to you. I can see there's just got a little spot of something on it. That's better. The first blade there, and just fit the blades going round in a anti-clockwise pattern. I'm just using a toothpick there to help me seat those blades in position. That's it. They're all in place, and now I can put the shutter case in position. That only goes on in one direction. There's a lot of different things that help point out which way it goes. If you see this lever poking up here and this cutout, that matches with this area. You see this little stud, this pipe sticking up here, that comes through the case in that position. Just lower that on carefully. And we've got 3 screws that hold the case and the mechanism plate together. And just as earlier when working on the diaphragm, do the screws up very lightly indeed until you've ensured that the blades are all sitting correctly in position and that they weren't accidentally displaced when you're putting the case back over the mechanism plate, which can certainly happen. Doesn't happen very often, but every now and then you get a reminder. Right, so I just checked that those blades opened and shut. That was good. So now I can tighten my 3 screws up. Yeah, so there's our shutter blades, all nice and clean. The action's snappy, no resistance. That's exactly as it should be. And the diaphragm, of course, moves nice and smoothly too. So we've dealt with the most serious sticky problems with our shutter, and certainly the ones that would have caused the shutter to not function very well indeed. So from here on in we can start putting the rest of the componentry back into the shutter. All the control stuff from the front and the diaphragm setting lever, etc. at the rear.